After years of relative quiet, the Syrian Civil War flared up once again, seemingly out of nowhere. The Assad regime, which was deemed victorious by many and in control of the situation, crumbled within days after the rebels launched their decisive offensive. The situation is far from stable in Syria, and it is very challenging to predict what will happen next. For now, we want to talk about the Syrian Civil War up until now, its causes, how everything started, who fought who, and answer your questions you may have about this incredibly complex and tragic war. Every week, we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. On the eve of the Arab Spring, Syria was considered one of the most oppressive countries in the world. Since 1970, the Al-Assad family has ruled over Syria. First it was the father Hafez and then his son Bashar who became Syria's president following his father's death in 2000. Neither had any tolerance for dissent and criticism. The lives of thousands of Syrians were destroyed by state-sponsored violence and repression. Syria under the Assad family was a one-party state without any opposition. In a nutshell, the main power base of the Assad's rule was the coalition of the Alawites, military and Ba'ath Party elites. When the Arab Spring spread through Tunisia, Egypt and several other countries, Syria was initially relatively quiet. Early attempts of the Syrian people to mobilize against the government were futile, but everything changed when the security services cracked down on teenagers writing anti-regime graffiti in Dara and arrested them. For decades, Syrian society had endured crackdowns like this and much worse, and the Syrian security forces were confident that they were going to get away with it this time too. Still, the spirit of resistance spreading through the Middle East in the Arab Spring had finally arrived in the Levant as well. In mid-March 2011, mass demonstrations calling for the release of political prisoners and political reforms started throughout Syria. The regime reacted in a predictably violent manner, but protests persisted. Assad decided to use the carrot and stick approach to quell the protest movement. On the one hand, the army was now sent to defeat the protest movement, while the security services were now firing live ammunition at protesters. On the other hand, the Syrian dictator started talking about national reconciliation, the release of political prisoners, reform, and the importance of political pluralism. Evidently, the Syrian people did not trust Bashar Assad, and quite soon his resignation and an end to the Assad regime became the key demand of the protest movement. In response, the regime's violence got only worse, with Dara, several suburbs of Damascus, and towns throughout Syria starting to be besieged by the army. And this is where cracks in the regime started to show. Some in the military started to defect, refusing to fire on peaceful protesters. Some defectors switched sides and vowed to protect the people with arms from the regime's violence. On June 4, 2011, the first armed insurrection took place in Jisr al-Shagur, a town which saw hundreds of protesters massacred by Bashar's father in 1980. Around 100 soldiers were killed in this first major act of armed rebellion of the Syrian Civil War. In July, defectors from the army announced the formation of the Free Syrian Army, with the stated aim of protecting the Syrian people from the government crackdown. In August, several major opposition groups, ranging from the Muslim Brotherhood to secular groups, came together in Istanbul to announce the formation of the Syrian National Council. The Syrian Revolution was transitioning from a peaceful revolution to a full-scale civil war in response to the months-long brutal crackdown of the Assad regime. By the end of 2011, non-violent protests had transitioned into armed resistance. While the rebels initially united under the banner of the Free Syrian Army, it was by no means a monolithic group. Defectors from the Syrian army got together with some of the protesters in different cities to create the first ragtag rebel units, which were no match against the regular army. Hence, at the initial stage, the conflict resembled an insurgency. rebels would try to ambush the Syrian army units and defend the neighborhoods they were in control of. They were particularly active in Sunni-dominated regions of the country, due to the strong resentment of the Sunnis to the Alawite-dominated rule of the Assad family. The first big battle of the civil war took place in September 2011 in Al-Rastan, and the superior firepower and the technological advantage of the Syrian regular army were sufficient to rout the rebels. Skirmishes, bombardment, ambushes and raids were also registered in Homs, Damascus and Idlib. Particularly heavy fighting and urban shelling of Homs by the government forces were taking place. The situation was very fluid at this point. Rebels would take control of a neighborhood, then the regime's forces would bombard them and conduct a ground assault to take over that neighborhood, only to be ambushed by a unit at a checkpoint, which would defect at that exact point. The Syrian army would sometimes have to attack the same town more than once, since right after they left after taking a town, another rebel group would emerge, or a military unit would defect, stretching the capabilities of the regime's army. Against the background of this chaotic situation, rebels controlled disconnected pockets, most notably in Idlib, Homs and Zabadani, on the eve of the first international attempt to stop the war in Syria. This is when it makes sense to take a step back and discuss how the main global and regional powers positioned themselves at the early stages of the Syrian war. After all, their involvement was crucial, if not outright decisive, at different stages of the civil war. The United States strongly condemned the regime's brutality against peaceful protesters right from the start, and in August 2011, President Obama called on Assad to step down. Personal sanctions against Assad and key regime leaders, and economic sanctions, including the freezing of Syrian assets, were enacted. Americans also provided non-lethal aid to the Free Syrian Army early in the war. The European Union largely followed the American lead, along with providing significant humanitarian aid to displaced Syrians. As with the intensification of the civil war, more and more Syrians started fleeing the country for Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon. A key regional actor, Turkey also supported the opposition and allowed the Free Syrian Army to use its territory. Ankara called for stronger international reaction and concrete measures to protect civilians, including a possible intervention. As thousands of Syrian refugees poured into Turkey, Prime Minister Erdogan's rhetoric became more aggressive towards Assad, as he urged the creation of no-fly zones over Syria and safe havens for refugees on its territory. After the initial attempts at mediation, the Arab League, led by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, were also very critical of Assad's crackdown against the protesters, and in November 2011, they banned Syria from the Arab League. They imposed sanctions and started providing support to the rebels. One of their key goals here was to counter Iranian influence over Syria. Shia Iran saw the Alawite Assad regime as a natural ally in the Middle East and a crucial part of its supply chain to the axis of resistance, or its proxies, depending on how you want to look at it. Iran sent its advisors from the Islamic Revolution Guards Corps to support Assad's army, while also facilitating the arrival of Hezbollah fighters to Syria. Finally, it is extremely important to examine Russia's involvement in Syria. Remember, Syria has been Moscow's ally since the Cold War. The Soviet Union has operated the Tartus naval base on the Mediterranean coast of Syria since the 1970s. Of course, later on in the war, Russia's support was crucial for the survival of Bashar Assad, but at the initial stage, Putin was more reserved. So even though he sent military aid to Assad, the full-scale Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war came several years later. But the Kremlin still gave invaluable diplomatic support to the Assad regime, along with China, at a time when it was being isolated globally. Both countries routinely vetoed any UN-sponsored action in Syria, including official condemnation, imposition of sanctions, and possibly other stronger measures. So by the time Syria became engulfed in the flames of bloody internal fighting, the global coalitions supporting the sides became evident too. The United States, the EU, Turkey, and most powerful Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which called themselves the Friends of Syria, supported the opposition and demanded Assad's resignation, while Russia, China and Iran gave their backing to the incumbent regime. Of course, the alliances would shift throughout the war, and the opposition-backing countries would be far from acting as a unified front, since each of them pursued their narrow interests, their own often flawed vision of Syria's future, which usually manifested in supporting different rebel groups. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In April 2012, the government and the opposition agreed to a UN-brokered ceasefire in an effort led by the former Secretary-General Kofi Annan. But this ill-fated ceasefire attempt shattered rather quickly as violence in Syria continued. In May 2012, the government violently dispersed a crowd of protesters in Al-Hula, then shelled the civilians and FSA fighters with artillery and tanks, before sending in regular army units and pro-Assad Shabiha militia to the city. More than 100 unarmed Syrians were killed in this massacre. A similar tactic was used in Al-Kabir, a village near Hama, where dozens of residents were killed by Shabihas after intense artillery shelling by the government. At this point, Assad felt that he could annihilate the opposition through brutal force and indiscriminate killing, but instead he let the genie out of the bottle. More violence led to more response from the rebels and gave more legitimacy to foreign powers to support these rebel groups. Gradually, the civil war spread. At this point, roughly 60,000 Syrian soldiers had defected, many of whom joined the Free Syrian Army. In July 2012, the battles in the two largest cities, Damascus and Aleppo, started. This is when the Assad regime started using fighter jets, bombarding the rebels and rebel-controlled civilian areas, causing indiscriminate destruction and killing. Initially, the rebels succeeded in taking over some districts in Damascus. A suicide attack killed the Syrian defense minister, Daoud Raja, and his deputy and Assad's brother-in-law, Asef Shokat. However, the government's counterattack pushed the rebel units out of the capital by early August, even though sporadic fighting in the form of insurgency continued. The Battle of Aleppo was way more protracted and would last for more than 4 years. However, at its first stage, the FSA was successful. They captured a significant portion of the city and took control of the Anadan border checkpoint, which meant that the rebels now had a direct supply line from Turkey to Aleppo. Around the same time, they captured all border checkpoints between Syria and Iraq, which facilitated the arrival of foreign fighters, including jihadists, further exacerbating the civil war. A troubling situation also started developing for the regime in the Kurdish majority regions in the north. Taking advantage of the disorder, PKK's Syrian offshoot, YPG, launched a military campaign against the government to take control of the Kurdish majority areas and declare self-rule. As the Syrian army was busy fighting the rebels in Damascus and Aleppo, the YPG took over the majority of the border strip in the north, including most of the country's oil reserves. They still control most of this territory to this day, after declaring the autonomous administration of Rojava. Despite their setback in Damascus, by late 2012, the rebel groups had momentum on the battlefield. They had captured most of the Deir ez-Zor governorate and parts of the city of Deir ez-Zor, the biggest in eastern Syria. In November, they seized Sarakib, a strategic city on the M5 highway, connecting all key Syrian cities, Aleppo, Hama, Homs and Damascus. Further gains were made in the Aleppo, Idlib and Hama governorates. The rebel area of control in and around the capital Damascus was expanded too, with the capture of Douma and Yarmouk. For the first time in the civil war, the rebels made notable gains inside the Alawite majority Latakia governorate. The situation looked extremely problematic for Assad, and it seemed like his army and regime were being cornered by the rebels. By late 2012, they had lost all of Syria's north and most of the east. Rebels had control of the border with Turkey and Iraq. They had captured significant territories in and around Damascus, Aleppo and Homs. But the armed opposition had one significant flaw. It was disorganized, without a proper central command. Initially, the Free Syrian Army consisted of 22 separate armed factions, but over time it grew. The problem was that the FSA leadership was in Turkey and had little influence over events happening on the ground in Syria. Communication was a major problem. Moreover, even though these groups on paper accepted operating under the FSA umbrella, their origins, ideology, geography of operations, and many other factors made them de facto independent. By mid-2012, when the rebels were getting the upper hand on the battlefield, they consisted of 4 main groups: Liwa al-Islam, which later became Jaish al-Islam, operating in Damascus, Sugur al-Sham and Kataib al-Ra al-Sham in Idlib, and Liba al-Tawhid in Aleppo. All were Islamist groups, but all of them besides Kataib Ashar al-Sham operated under the FSA umbrella. In September 2012, Liwa al-Islam, Liwa al-Tawhid and Sugur al-Sham announced the creation of the Syrian Islamic Liberation Front, SILF, within the FSA. These groups made up around half of the entire FSA, which meant that the FSA leadership in Turkey was losing further influence over events in Syria. Later in December 2012, 11 other groups, including Ara al-Sham, created the Syrian Islamic Front, weakening the FSA even more. In December 2012, the Friends of Syria group gathered 260 armed opposition groups in Antalya to create a unified command, and the result was the Supreme Military Council, SMC. It helped the Syrian opposition to gain more international legitimacy, hence the increased foreign military and financial aid. According to Charles Lister, the CIA used the SMC network to facilitate the small-scale delivery of weapons in early 2013 to groups which were vetted as more reliable. But most of the weapon deliveries from Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Turkey were still carried out by using personal contacts within rebel groups. So instead of organizing centralized arms delivery, the foreign actors backing the opposition in Syria chose to work directly with the organizations and people they knew. This caused competition for resources among the rebel groups and further deteriorated the spirit of cooperation among them. The FSA and the secular opposition were failing to assert themselves, while their governance in areas under their control left a lot to be desired. And this left a lot of space for the jihadist groups to exploit. An FSA commander in Hama said this: "Al-Nusra really took advantage of the Free Army's failure to control territory effectively and to help the people justly. That's why we now have to deal with Al-Nusra as a fait accompli." Jabhat al-Nusra is the affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and in 2012 they came to the forefront of the Syrian Civil War as a very organized and potent military force. It was led by none other than Ahmed Hussein al-Shara, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Jilani. In early 2013, they captured the Taftanaz airbase in Idlib, seizing a significant amount of equipment, including tanks, helicopters and rocket launchers. In March 2013, the rebels, led by al-Nusra and Ara al-Sham, achieved an important success by capturing their first provincial capital, Raqqa. We have already mentioned the gross human rights abuses carried out by the Assad regime, but the rebels, particularly the jihadist groups, did their own fair share of abhorrent acts too. For instance, the capture of Raqqa was followed by persecution, killing and displacement of Christian residents of this city. Before that, there was the infamous incident of a rebel commander eating the heart and liver of a dead government soldier on camera. Such actions decreased the global sympathies to the rebel cause in Syria. But none would have as detrimental an impact as the sudden emergence of the most fundamentalist jihadist group yet, the Islamic State. Another offshoot of Al-Qaeda, it took advantage of the power vacuum left by the US withdrawal from Iraq, and capitalized on chaos in Syria as well. In the spring of 2013, they gained a foothold in eastern Syria and Raqqa. In April 2013, ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi announced that al-Nusra was being merged into ISIS. However, al-Jilani of al-Nusra rejected this statement, which set the stage for conflict between these two fundamentalist groups. Many foreign fighters left al-Nusra for ISIS. Even though both groups had the same origins and shared the Islamist fundamentalist ideology, there were key distinctions. Al-Nusra's main focus was to overthrow Assad and gain power in Syria, while ISIS aimed to use the chaos in the Middle East to establish a caliphate. In that sense, al-Nusra was primarily a Syria-oriented organization, while ISIS had a more global agenda of establishing its own state, without any consideration for borders, fighting the West and attracting jihadists from all around the world. Moreover, the brutal and shocking methods employed by ISIS made al-Nusra appear relatively moderate in comparison. Meanwhile, despite major setbacks, Assad had no intention of giving up. Bolstered by significant support from Iran and Hezbollah, he started to fight back. With the Iranian backing, he facilitated the emergence of the National Defense Forces from the Shia militia groups, which was reportedly overseen by Qasem Soleimani. In April 2013, they launched an operation to take Al-Qusayr, a key city in the Homs province, with an aim to establish a corridor from Damascus to the Alawite-majority provinces of Latakia and Tartus, along with pushing back the rebels from the Homs province. And the Assad forces gained a major victory, capturing Al-Qusayr and other rebel-controlled areas of the Homs province. The SMC command tried to organize the defense of the city beyond the local rebel groups. Several of its commanders were deployed to Al-Qusayr to assume command, but local rebel groups ignored them. It was an indication that basically all Syrian rebel groups were acting independently, without any real central power to unite and direct them. In the following months, the situation became only more chaotic. Everyone was fighting everyone. The government fought the rebels, there was rebel infighting between the jihadists and the rest, while the jihadists also fought with the Kurdish groups. The front lines continued shifting regularly amidst intense fighting, but the brutality reached a whole new level with the Ghouta chemical attack of August 2013. Up until that point, America's involvement in the Syrian Civil War was rather minor, manifesting mainly in the form of small-scale support to several rebel groups. There were calls for the United States to intervene to put an end to the brutality of the Assad regime, but after debacles in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Obama administration wanted to avoid another military involvement in the Middle East. A year before the Ghouta attack, he clearly determined a chemical attack by the Assad regime as a red line, crossing which would prompt a strong response by the United States. On August 21st, several rockets containing chemical agent sarin were used to attack the opposition-held Ghouta suburb of Damascus. Hundreds were killed in this attack, which the rebels, the United States, Europe, and Turkey blamed on Assad, while the government and Russia accused rebels of orchestrating a false flag attack. The opposition expected the United States to react to this attack in some fashion. But instead, the Obama administration struck a deal with Russia, according to which Assad was going to give up his chemical weapons arsenal for destruction. America's failure to act had a demoralizing effect on the secular opposition. The FSA and the SMC lost whatever credibility they had. Assad and the Islamist groups were quick to take advantage of this. ISIS captured Azaz from an FSA-linked rebel group, while 13 opposition groups left the SMC. This includes powerful groups like Jals al-Islam, Suqo al-Sham, and Liwa al-Tawhid, which created a new alliance called the Islamic Front, encouraged by Qatar, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Several other alliances, like the Syrian Revolutionaries Front (SRF), Jaish al-Mujahideen, and Harakat Hazm, emerged from the ashes of the SMC. A US-backed Southern Front emerged in the south. In early 2014, most of the action in the Syrian Civil War was taking place between ISIS and other rebel groups. Initially, groups formerly associated with the FSA, the Islamic Front, and Al-Nusra pushed ISIS out of portions of the Aleppo and Idlib provinces, while also taking control of Aleppo city and Raqqa. But lack of coordination and internal divisions among these groups played into the hands of al-Baghdadi's organization. They employed tactics such as mass execution of captured fighters, which shocked the world and made other rebel groups appear way more moderate. In January, ISIS captured Raqqa. They then pushed the rebels from significant portions of northern Syria, including Manbij and Jarablus, along with capturing several towns in the Aleppo governorate. After defeating al-Nusra by mid-2014, they had captured most of the Deir ez-Zor province, including its oil reserves, ensuring steady financing. They controlled most of the border with Iraq, which helped with the arrival of foreign jihadist fighters to Syria. They captured some land controlled by the YPG in Hasaka province. ISIS now was in charge of more territories than all the rebel groups combined. With most of Iraq, a significant portion of Syria, and lucrative oil reserves under their control, along with a formidable amount of military equipment captured from Iraqi and Syrian stockpiles, ISIS proclaimed the caliphate, with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as its caliph. Such a rapid advance of ISIS, accompanied with its aggressive media campaign, turned most of the attention in the Syrian Civil War to the fight against them. The government air force picked up the pace of airstrikes against ISIS, with heavy battles between the sides in the Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor provinces. Rebel groups fought them in Aleppo province. The Islamic State forces continued gaining more ground in Syria, while committing more atrocities. The execution of the American journalist James Foley, mass execution of captured Ba'athist soldiers, and beheadings of hostages, many of which were filmed and shared on social media, gained ISIS further notoriety. In September 2014, ISIS launched an offensive on the Kurdish-controlled Kobani or Ain al-Arab district on the border with Turkey, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic moments of the Syrian Civil War. ISIS quickly captured dozens of villages to start the siege of Kobani, forcing thousands of Kurdish people to flee to Turkey. Since Kobani did not have a link to other Kurdish-controlled areas, they were in a tough spot. There were calls for Turkey to help fight off ISIS in Kobani, but they were reluctant to join forces with the YPG, which is an affiliate of the PKK, an organization Turkey has been fighting for decades. Instead, they opened the border to allow those willing to fight against ISIS to join the defense of Kobani. At this point, the United States started conducting airstrikes against ISIS to halt its advance in Kobani and elsewhere in Syria. After capturing dominant heights on the outskirts of the city, in early October, the Battle of Kobani began. ISIS had some 9,000 fighters to capture Kobani, and by mid-October, half of the city fell under their control. But the American airstrikes and the arrival of reinforcements helped turn the tide. The YPG and its allies gradually retook lost territories in and around Kobani, inflicting the first major defeat on ISIS in the Syrian Civil War in early 2015. The rise of ISIS in Syria, which drew all the media attention to itself with its brutality, pushed al-Nusra to demonstrate its true ideological colors more vividly as well. They started implementing harsher punishments, such as stoning to death for adultery, and in general, a version of governance akin to other Islamist fundamentalist entities. One of its autonomous units, the Khorasan Group, was subject to the American airstrikes. But since al-Nusra was a key member of the anti-Assad coalition in Syria, many rebel groups condemned the airstrikes. Some of them did that to demonstrate their loyalty to the revolutionary cause, understanding that Al-Nusra was one of the strongest groups opposing Assad, but others simply had to do it out of fear. An FSA commander based in Damascus said, "When Al-Nusra declared their allegiance to Al-Qaeda in April 2013, the Free Army began to change its vision of the group, but we did not have the strength to do more than that. We were suspicious. After the American strikes, we became even more suspicious, but at the same time, we were trapped. How could we do anything but protest? We were always asked why we accept Al-Qaeda within our midst. It's simple, we wouldn't if we had more support and were more confident in our allies in the international community." Groups that dared to oppose Al-Nusra in North Syria, where Al-Nusra was at its strongest, for instance the American-supported SRF and Harakat Hazm, were defeated by them in early 2015. In the south, where Al-Nusra was not as strong, the American-backed Southern Front vowed to cease all cooperation with Al-Nusra, but Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate remained strong in the north. In March 2015, they got together with several other Islamist groups, like Qara al-Sham and a couple of smaller secular groups, to create the Jaish al-Fatah, which captured the city of Idlib, defeating the government forces. Meanwhile, ISIS recovered from its failure in Kobani and launched another offensive, this time in central Syria. Struggling to fight on several fronts and under pressure in the north, the government forces were overwhelmed in Palmyra. This historic city of a rich cultural heritage fell to ISIS in May 2015, after about 2 weeks of fighting. The jihadists conducted mass murder here as well, along with destroying numerous historical monuments and artifacts of the pre-Islamic era. In August, they captured al-Quraytain, approaching Homs and Damascus. These consecutive losses by Assad further derailed the morale of his army and Hezbollah fighting in Syria. The Assad regime may have been on the brink, with most of the north under rebel and Kurdish control, the east under ISIS, and much of the south taken by the Southern Front. According to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, at this point in September 2015, Assad controlled only 26% of the Syrian territory. The ongoing trend was clearly against him, and after successfully concluding the first phase of its aggression against Ukraine amidst Western inaction, Russia felt that it should act decisively to save its longtime ally, the Assad family, from being overthrown. In September 2015, the Russians started conducting airstrikes on ISIS and rebels. This was a huge deal, as gaining aerial supremacy drastically changed the situation for the pro-Assad camp. It was an important boost of morale for them, and in October, the government forces and Hezbollah launched a ground offensive north of Hama, with an aim to secure the M5 highway. Simultaneously, another offensive was launched from the government-controlled territories in the Aleppo province towards the M5 highway. In both cases, the pro-Assad forces suffered major losses, but gained ground on the rebels. They were particularly successful on the Aleppo front, cutting most of the rebel supply line to the city. Another offensive was launched in the Latakia province, and by early 2016, the Syrian government took important positions on the border area from the rebels, making supply from Turkey more challenging. The Russian airstrikes and the increased support by Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards helped the Ba'athist army to regain strategic initiative in the Syrian Civil War. Their territorial gains were modest, but after years of mostly defending against the rebels and ISIS, they were finally dictating the developments on the battlefield to some extent. The start of the Russian military involvement in the Syrian Civil War raised international tensions. Turkey and Russia were on different sides of the fence here. After protesting against the violation of its airspace by Russian military aircraft several times, on the 24th of November 2015, a Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian Su-24M fighter jet, causing a diplomatic crisis between the sides. Putin accused Turkey of supporting ISIS, imposed economic sanctions, and banned commercial flights to Turkey, along with conducting airstrikes on Turkish-backed rebel groups in Syria. The diplomatic tensions were really high at this point, with accusations of atrocities and war crimes flying back and forth. But the American-Russian deal, followed by the 26th of February 2016 UN Security Council resolution, resulted in the sides achieving a ceasefire, which worked at least to some extent until the summer. The fighting between the government and rebels subsided considerably, but the ceasefire did not put any limits on hostilities against the recognized terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Nusra. Hence, airstrikes against these groups continued, and in March, the government forces, backed by Russia and Iran, pushed ISIS out of Palmyra. In June, the ceasefire completely collapsed, when they started an offensive to push the rebels out of Aleppo. In July, the Ba'athist forces captured the last supply line to the rebel-held territories of Aleppo. But instead of surrendering, the rebels launched a counterattack, breaking their encirclement. But the government forces enjoyed air supremacy and pushed the rebels back to restart the siege of the city in September. Aleppo was under relentless shelling and airstrikes. Thousands of civilians were killed in them. The government forces gradually advanced, and by December 2016, the rebels were forced to give up Aleppo. The 4-year Battle of Aleppo ended with an Assad victory. This was a strategic success for the Ba'athist regime, and a victory of Russia over Turkey. The tensions between the sides reached an all-time high when the Russian ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, was assassinated at an art exhibition in Ankara by an off-duty Turkish policeman in response to the Russian airstrikes in Aleppo. But the sides managed to avoid further escalation, instead acting as guarantors of another ceasefire attempt between the government and the opposition in December 2016. Another important battle was going on between the Kurds, ISIS, and rebels in the north. The Kurds had 2 separate pockets of territory on the border with Turkey under their control, and they intended to link them up. In February 2016, they took advantage of the government offensive on Aleppo and captured Tal Rafat in the north from the rebels, cutting one of their supply lines from Turkey. Simultaneously, they attacked ISIS in Al-Hasaka province in eastern Syria. But the situation truly escalated when the YPG, or the Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF), launched an offensive on Manbij in May with the support of the American Air Force. Their march across the Euphrates was initially successful, and they captured Manbij in August. The SDF came closer to linking up Afrin with the rest of the Kurdish-controlled territory. Turkey saw this as a threat to its national security. They considered the YPG nothing more than the Syrian affiliate of the PKK, an organization recognized as a terrorist entity by Turkey and the majority of Western countries. Ankara was concerned that a YPG-ruled territory in Syria adjacent to its border would create a convenient base of operations for the PKK, a group Turkey has been fighting against for decades. So, with that in mind, and with an aim to end the ISIS presence on its border, Turkey, backed by Syrian Turkmen rebel units and other Turkey-backed groups, launched Operation Euphrates Shield. On August 24, 2016, they captured Jarabulus. By mid-September, all of the ISIS-controlled border strip was under Turkish and rebel control. Turkey demanded the YPG withdraw to the east of the Euphrates, and the United States backed this demand. But despite promises, apparently some YPG groups stayed in Manbij, and this set the stage for hostilities between them and the Turkish army in the future. Gradually, the Turkish army and the Turkish-backed rebels advanced southwards amidst heavy resistance by ISIS. They stalled the Turkish and rebel advance around Al-Bab for months before being forced to withdraw from the town in February 2017. At this point, ISIS was under a lot of pressure on all sides. They were under relentless airstrikes from the United States and Russia, and on the defensive both in Syria and Iraq. In March 2016, the US-backed Revolutionary Commando Army captured the Al-Tanf border crossing with Iraq from ISIS. In November 2016, the SDF launched an offensive to clear ISIS out of Raqqa. The SDF advanced from Ain Issa and captured dozens of villages on Raqqa's doorstep. But ISIS resisted heavily, understanding that losing their Syrian capital Raqqa would mean a huge propaganda defeat. Bloody battles went on for months. But in May 2017, the SDF captured Tabqa Dam, completing the encirclement of Raqqa. ISIS was now trapped, but it would continue resisting fiercely for 5 more months, fighting virtually for each house in this bitter urban battle. More than 2,000 civilians were killed in heavy urban battle and relentless airstrikes on the city. On October 17th, Raqqa was seized by the SDF. This was an important turning point in the fight against ISIS. It all went downhill for this terrorist organization after the Battle of Raqqa, as they continued losing ground to the SDF and the pro-Assad forces from that point on. By mid-2017, the situation on the battlefield and the main trends in the Syrian Civil War had become more or less clear. The pro-Assad forces, buoyed by Russian and Iranian support, were now the strongest military in Syria. They enjoyed Russian air support, while participation of capable ground forces like the Wagner PMC and Hezbollah gave them sufficient firepower and discipline to gradually expand their territories. But still, it was not strong enough to defeat all the rebel forces and solve the Syrian Civil War in its favor, once and for all. Meanwhile, rebel forces were strong enough and had sufficient Turkish backing to control Idlib and surrounding areas, but in Homs and Damascus provinces, they were now on the defensive. In the south, around Dara and Quneitra, the United States, Jordan, Saudi Arabia and Qatar-backed Southern Front was also under a lot of pressure from the attacks of the government forces and Russian airstrikes. Here too, the initiative was in the hands of the pro-Assad coalition. Some semblance of status quo had emerged in Syria, and the 4th of May 2017 Astana deal, signed between Russia, Iran and Turkey, was a de facto recognition of this status quo. The sides announced the creation of 4 de-escalation zones: the Idlib province, parts of the Homs Governorate, and eastern Ghouta under rebel control, and the Jordan-Syria border. Some rebel groups rejected this deal. Particularly, the Kurdish leaders were unhappy with it, criticizing the agreement for dividing Syria up on a sectarian basis. And even though this agreement did not put an end to hostilities, it delivered the outline of the eventual ceasefire in Syria that persisted for several years. But obviously, ISIS was not part of any ceasefire deals, so the fight against them continued. We already talked about the liberation of Raqqa. The next important stage of this fight was in Deir ez-Zor. In August, the Syrian government forces launched an offensive to lift a siege of Deir ez-Zor, a city which had been under ISIS siege for 3 years. In September, ISIS was repulsed from the surroundings of this city, and the siege was lifted. By the end of the year, the Ba'athist forces on one hand and the SDF on the other had practically defeated ISIS. The organization still operates in Syria in some fashion to this day, but its rapid ascent in 2013 to 14 was followed by a similarly rapid downfall in 2016 and 2017. But the civil war was far from over. Turkey still had no intention of tolerating the YPG's presence on its border, and in January 2018 launched another cross-border operation, this time on Afrin. They were backed by the Turkey-supported coalition of rebel groups called the Syrian National Army. In March, they captured Afrin. Thousands of Kurds fled the region. Meanwhile, thousands of Ghouta residents were fleeing the government offensive there. Since 2013, the Ghouta suburb of Damascus had been under rebel control. It was the target of arguably the worst chemical attack in this war. Growing in confidence after his recent victories, in February, Assad launched an offensive on Ghouta to capture this rebel-held stronghold right at the doorstep of his capital. In April, another chemical attack was carried out on Douma, killing 70 people. Again, the government blamed the opposition for this. The United States and France conducted airstrikes on government forces, but this did not stop Assad from capturing this rebel-held pocket north of Damascus. In mid-April, it fell to Assad. The next targets were Dara and Quneitra in the south. In July, Assad captured Dara. The southern front and Tahrir al-Sham continued resisting the government in Quneitra, but overwhelmed by the Russian airstrikes and superior firepower of the government army, they agreed to evacuate to Idlib province, still held by the rebels. The government completed taking the whole border region with Jordan under control after defeating the small ISIS-controlled pocket by the end of the summer of 2018. In September, Assad started preparations to attack the last remaining major territory under rebel control in the northwest, most of the Idlib province and parts of Aleppo, Latakia and Hama provinces. Thousands of rebels and civilian refugees fleeing from the territories overtaken by the regime had now gathered in this area. As the bombardments started, it seemed that the offensive was inevitable. But the presence of Turkish troops arguably dissuaded Assad and his foreign backers from making the final push. It would be a major escalation for the Assad army and his Russian and Iranian backers to fight against the Turkish army. Therefore, this rebel-held territory was relatively safe from the Assad attacks. In September 2018, Turkey and Russia reached a deal whereby the sides agreed to create a demilitarized zone to be patrolled by these two countries. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which was the strongest rebel organization in this territory and created the Salvation Government to govern it, was to leave this area. In exchange, Assad would not attack it. But the deal was never implemented. HTS did not leave the demilitarized area, and in fact expanded its area of control, as other major rebel groups were gradually defeated or dissolved, while the government forces continued attacking. In April 2019, pro-Assad forces launched an offensive to defeat the rebels in the northwest once and for all. Although the offensive continued for 4 months and the government captured some ground north of Hama, it failed to reach its strategic goal, and the HTS continued controlling a significant part of the northwest. This seemed like a small matter at the time. Meanwhile, the YPG-dominated Syrian Democratic Forces defeated the last significant ISIS pocket in Syria after capturing Baghouz in April 2019. In October, its leader, al-Baghdadi, was killed by the American Special Forces. Since one of the stated goals of the American presence in Syria was to fight against ISIS, after largely defeating this organization, the US officials started announcing their intention to withdraw from Syria. The remaining issue was the fate of the Kurdish allies. Turkey wanted the withdrawal of the Kurdish forces from the border areas and threatened them with another invasion, while the United States considered any incursion against its Kurdish allies unacceptable. In August 2019, Turkey and the USA reached an agreement to create a buffer zone between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. YPG forces would withdraw completely, while the SDF would give up its heavy weapons. Turkish and American forces would patrol this area jointly, while some Syrian refugees in Turkey would be relocated to this safe zone. But by early October, this plan fell apart. Turkey restarted its preparations to invade the area, and rather unexpectedly, the US President Trump decided to withdraw the American troops from this area. The SDF considered this a stab in the back by the Americans and a green light for the Turkish operation. On October 9th, the Turkish military and Turkey-backed Syrian National Army advanced towards Tel Abyad, Ras Al Ain, and several other targets. They made important progress, which prompted the SDF to seek help from Russia and Assad. Syrian and Russian forces entered Manbij and Kobani to prevent the Turkish attack on this area. On October 22nd, Russia and Turkey signed the Sochi Agreement, whereby a 30-kilometer deep buffer zone from the Euphrates River to the Iraq border would be established. Turkey would retain the sole control of the areas captured during this operation, while the Syrian and Russian troops would patrol the rest of the border strip, apart from Qamishli, the de facto capital of the Kurdish autonomous area. The YPG was to withdraw from this buffer zone. Although skirmishes between the sides would occur from time to time, this arrangement would remain in force until the most recent escalation. Turkey ensured there was no YPG immediately on the border. Assad restored control over some of the border territories, while Russia strengthened its position as the key stakeholder in Syria. The last big offensive of the Syrian Civil War until 2024 was launched by the Syrian Army in late 2019. The Ba'athist forces attacked the rebels west of Aleppo and south of Idlib to take full control of the key M5 highway. By February 2020, Assad restored control over the highway and laid siege on several Turkish observation points in the area. Apparently, he got so confident with his army's advance that he dared to conduct airstrikes on the Turkish military positions in Balyur, which killed 34 Turkish soldiers. In response, Turkey launched another ground assault and pushed back the Syrian army from the Zawiya mountain before Putin convinced Erdogan to agree to another ceasefire. So to summarize, in mid-2020, Assad controlled roughly 65% of the Syrian territory with all major cities, including Damascus, Aleppo, Homs and Latakia. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group controlled Idlib and the surrounding area in the northwest. There was a small border area of Al-Tanf, controlled by the US-backed rebel groups, while the Kurds had their autonomous administration in a considerable territory in the northeast. According to different estimates, around 600,000 Syrians were killed in the civil war. Almost 7 million Syrians became refugees in Turkey, Jordan, Germany, Lebanon, and many other countries. The country was utterly destroyed. According to the Carnegie Endowment's estimates, Syria needed anywhere from $250 billion to $400 billion to reconstruct. And for all the losses and suffering that the Syrian people underwent, the same man who they wanted to depose was still in charge of the country. Gradually, most of the countries who actively opposed Assad either restored diplomatic relations with him or considered improving relations with the incumbent regime. The Arab League reinstated Syria's membership in 2023. Saudi Arabia restored diplomatic relations. Even Erdogan, arguably the staunchest enemy of Assad, publicly called on the Syrian dictator to talk. Assad's victory seemed like a foregone conclusion, and the rebel-controlled Idlib as merely a minor nuisance. By 2019, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, became the dominant force in the remaining rebel-controlled territory around Idlib. Initially, HTS was considered as another offshoot of Al-Qaeda. In 2016, Al-Nusra rebranded itself as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, sending a message to the world and Syria that they are Al-Qaeda no more. In January 2017, they merged with several other Islamist factions to create Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The main difference of HTS from Al-Qaeda was its focus on Syria. HTS did not seek a global caliphate, instead proclaiming the victory of the Syrian revolution as its goal. Still, even though HTS was different from Al-Qaeda, it was still a Salafi jihadist group, which sought to establish Sharia law as a form of governance under the territories they controlled. HTS created a civilian body called the Salvation Government to conduct administration of Idlib and the surrounding areas. which in 2014 had a population of 4.5 million people. It imposed Sharia law and oppressed the opposition voices, like a group called the Hizb al-Tahrir. The living standards in the HTS-ruled territory were quite poor as well, due to factors outside its control, such as the overall destruction of the economy in Syria, the 2023 earthquake, problems in the Turkish economy, along with their own decisions such as the imposition of harsh taxes. But at the same time, HTS and its leader, Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, was now the de facto supreme commander of most of the rebels. The rebels who, when facing a choice of giving up arms or continuing the fight against Assad, chose the latter option. Many of them were experienced and with strong convictions against the Assad regime. Despite a widespread perception, even though HTS cooperated with Turkey and received military assistance from them, they were not a proxy and operated independently. But nothing really indicated that the Assad regime was under any imminent threat. Bashar Assad was in control of most of the country, enjoying a strong backing from Russia and Iran. And such a reliance on external powers was arguably the main factor behind his downfall. Assad continued neglecting his own army, hoping that Russia and Iran will always be there to protect him. On the eve of the decisive rebel offensive in November 2024, the Ba'athist army was suffering from degradation and low morale. According to The Times, a second lieutenant in the Syrian army received a meagre salary of £16 per month. Inadequate salaries and poor management of the army led to ubiquitous corruption in the Ba'athist military. At the same time, Russia is quite busy in Ukraine and pouring all its resources to win its protracted special military operation. Hezbollah has been severely weakened after more than a year of fighting with Israel, with its command structure decapitated. Iran's situation is not much better, and a significant portion of its capacity is being spent on waging direct and indirect warfare against Israel against the background of economic degradation. Hence, only his army could have protected Assad, but years of neglect meant that the government forces were utterly unprepared and unwilling to fight. Thus, when in November, HTS launched its attack on Aleppo, the world witnessed a shocking rout of the Syrian government forces. Within a day, Aleppo fell to the rebels. Next was Hama. The Assad army tried to make a stand here and even had a couple of successful localized counterattacks. But by December 5th, Hama was captured by HTS too. All this was happening despite considerable Russian airstrikes. Homs was captured 2 days later. Simultaneously, another rebel coalition, called the Southern Operations Room, launched an offensive from the south. Within a day, they took control of Damascus. Assad fled to Russia, and his dictatorship fell apart like a house of cards in 10 days. It is too early to say anything definitive about the future of Syria yet. The country is facing numerous major challenges. How is it going to rebuild? Are all the rebel groups going to be absorbed into the new HTS government? Is the Israeli occupation going to continue? What is going to happen to Kurdish autonomy? Can Syria stay united, given years of ethnic and sectarian conflict? Will Sunnis and Shias, Kurds and Turkmens be able to coexist peacefully after such a bitter and bloody war under an organization which was not particularly effective or tolerant when governing the Idlib province? These are all very difficult questions to answer, each perhaps deserving their own video. For now, Syria's new leader has given up his nom de guerre for his official name Ahmed Hussein al-Shara and his military fatigues for a suit and tie, and is spreading messages of peace and tolerance. Al-Jilani, or al-Shara, is saying all the right things about lack of interest in further warfare and rebuilding a war-torn country. An outside observer can only hope that, however difficult it may be to achieve, a peaceful and prosperous Syria will emerge from the ashes of decades-long dictatorship and years-long tragedy and war. More videos on modern conflicts are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member-exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.